Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Brief, a podcast focused on international affairs that aims to bring perspective, context, and analysis to help better understand our world today. I'm your host, Jim Clancy. Stunned, that's how many people said they reacted when they read this post from President Trump on April the 7th that he put on Truth Social. In it, President Trump threatened a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. He said the U.S. military had achieved complete and total regime change. I want to turn on that point and introduce three voices. Ken Roth, the former head of Human Rights Watch, Harvard Kennedy School International Affairs professor Stephen Walt, and Kourosh Ziabari, an award-winning journalist who covers the Iranian diaspora in the United States. What did they think when they read that post?
Well, first, I think it's important to stress that Trump was threatening blatant war crimes. To say that he was going to decimate civilian infrastructure is a war crime.
I thought it was two things. I thought it was a sign of just how desperate he was, that he was really flailing out, that he had no options. So he just decided to throw a bunch of rhetoric at the wall, if you will, and see if it went anywhere. And I think a consequence is that the rest of the world looks on at us and wonders what's happened, not to Donald Trump, but rather what's happened to Americans and why are 30% of the American people still supporting this guy?
Quite honestly, my first reaction was that I was actually shaking physically and I was shivering. He is someone who's clearly demonstrated a disregard for human life. It's not just the foreign countries or other people that he doesn't care about. He has clearly evidence that he doesn't care about American people.
All right, let's get into it. Stephen Walt, how much damage did President Trump do on his way to a climb down? Damage to America's relationships in the Middle East and also in Western Europe, with NATO as well.
Yeah, and I would add our allies in Asia as well. I mean, I think, you really have to step back and look at where we were 2 months ago before the war started and where we are today. 2 months ago, the Strait was open. Iran was contained. It had an unpopular and aging leadership. Oil was a lot cheaper. U.S. weapons stocks were fuller. The Dow was around 50,000, and negotiations were underway with Iran. And reportedly, according to some of the mediators, were making progress. So that's where we were before we went to war. Now the Dow is down, coming back today, of course, on the news of the ceasefire. Gas prices are way up, so inflation is up, and that's not going to go away for a while. Iran now controls the Straits of Hormuz, and we have to acknowledge that. In fact, the ceasefire effectively acknowledges that they'll keep earning money from tolls. The American president has looked somewhat deranged, threatening genocide and things like that. Our weapons stocks are down. And I think what the whole world really has now seen is that we have an impulsive president with a rather incompetent team of advisors. And moreover, that this is in a United States that doesn't care very much about its allies, didn't worry, didn't think through what the implications of this were going to be for allies in Europe who are more dependent on natural gas from the Middle East. Certainly didn't care about what it would mean for our allies in Asia who are very dependent on oil and gas from the Middle East. So, all of this adds up to the United States, looking like it doesn't know what it's doing. And they finally realized that, which is why they had to cut this ceasefire deal, which doesn't end things, but it at least gives us some time to try and work out something more lasting.
Kenneth Roth, you said on its face President Trump's threats amounted to a war crime all by themselves. But the administration argued that its threats against Iran's civilian infrastructure were really about dual-use targets.
If you had asked him to sort of provide a more micro justification, he might have said, the military uses electricity, the military drives over bridges, the military drinks water. Therefore, we can attack desalination plants, we can attack electrical generating facilities, we can bomb bridges. None of that is true, because even a dual-use item must pass what's known under international humanitarian law as the rule of proportionality. You cannot attack something, even if there's some marginal military benefit, if the harm to civilians will be disproportionate. And we've seen over and over that if you say destroy electricity, it undermines sanitation, it undermines hospitalization, refrigeration. It's disastrous for modern society. It can lead to huge scale loss of life. That's why the International Criminal Court has already charged 4 Russian military commanders for doing the exact same thing in Ukraine. So what Trump was threatening was at minimum a war crime, a large-scale war crime. His language actually was genocidal, trying to wipe out a civilization. So we should just make clear that these threats, if fulfilled, were utterly unlawful.
Kourosh, Ziabari, how has the months-long conflict with Iran played out amongst Iranians in the diaspora? You specifically covered that part of the story.
So this war, of course, has been a massive development, not in terms of its military aspect or the amount of destruction it's caused across Iran. It has been a flashpoint in the dynamics of Iranian diaspora, both in the US and elsewhere in Western Europe, in Canada, in Australia, and pretty much everywhere there is a community of Iranian exiles and expats. In a sense that it has further intensified the fault lines and existing divisions among Iranians everywhere. So many of them have actually celebrated and welcomed the first reports of U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran. And of course, many of them intuitively rejected that and denounced the attacks as an act of aggression, as it was. But what ensued was not just an expression of ideas or a civil discourse around the conflict and whether or not it was morally right or wrong. It was an extended period of inflammatory, incendiary rhetoric that many members of the diaspora exacerbated and intensified, especially through their social media behavior and through their participation in real-life activities that sometimes amounted to physical violence. In parts of Europe, there have been instances where members of Iran's exiled monarchy actually visited businesses, restaurants, demanding that the flags and the signs of Iran's monarchy be displayed. And these were Iranian businesses, actually. And then they threatened the staff with closure, evacuation, and other forms of retaliation if they refuse to comply.
Turning to the domestic front now, Stephen Walt, American voters have to accept some responsibility because as much as everyone seemed shocked Trump initiated this conflict, they knew who they were voting for.
Well, especially that this was a president who ran in both in 2016, but again in 2024 on the campaign that he wouldn't do the kind of stupid wars in the Middle East that some of his predecessors had gotten us into. He said that, Kamala Harris would be the war president and he was the peace candidate. And lots of people believed him because that had been his sort of consistent pitch. So this was a complete departure from the sort of Trump brand. And I think we're now starting to realize the consequences of, again, appointing an aging, impulsive president who doesn't really listen to advice and has surrounded himself with loyalists who won't give him good advice when he needs it.
There are going to be domestic political consequences. There probably should be. How do you see that sphere?
Well, this, I think, is a real setback for the Republican Party. And that's, again, assuming that things get settled, relatively quickly. It's quite possible the ceasefire will not hold. There'll be continued fighting. The straits will remain closed by and large. And so all of the problems of oil and gas not getting out, fertilizer not getting out to farmers around the world, etc., all of those things have not disappeared just with the ceasefire agreement. Even if the agreement holds, though, this will have economic consequences, and that's going to hurt Republican chances next November. I think also the sense that the United States has gotten the worst end of this deal, that Iran is now in a stronger position, despite the damage we've inflicted on them, is going to be clear to a number of others. And I think it has cost Trump some support, not a huge amount, but some support within the sort of MAGA base, who, again, believed that he was a peace candidate and now has been shown that he's not.
When you look at that 10-point plan that the Pakistanis put forward, it appears to be an Iranian plan, really, all of the points that are there. There are significant concessions to Iran. the ability to control the flow of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. They talk about reparations. They're in a perfect position then to exact tolls, if you will, on the shipping going through the Strait of Hormuz. It seems when we go down point by point, there's a lot of obstacles that still remain. When they get into negotiations, it's not going to be easy.
Well, it is interesting that the president has said that this 10-point plan, which again, I think I agree with you, very much leans in Iran's interest, he has said that this is a good basis for negotiations. That doesn't mean that that's the final agreement, the final deal that's ultimately reached. But it is interesting that we're already starting, over to some degree on the Iranian side. And I think that's a sign that, when you make a big strategic blunder, you don't get out of it free. You can't get away from that scot-free. You end up having to pay a price, having to make concessions. It seems to me the biggest challenge we are going to face, both we and the Israelis, if they decide to go along with this, is how do they convince Iran that they won't do this again, that we won't simply go mow the grass in 6 months or a year. Iran has no reason to trust us at this point, and they are going to need some assurances that we won't try and pull something like this down the road. And I think that gives them an incentive to make sure that Americans and others actually pay a substantial price here. I hope that the Iranians don't sort of overplay their hand, keep this going longer to drive that message home. But they clearly want Americans to realize this was a dumb idea and they shouldn't have done it in the first place, and we shouldn't try to repeat it down the road.
You mentioned Israel there, and there are still questions about how much they're going to go along with this. And looking at history, Prime Minister Netanyahu has a pattern of busting up, undermining, sabotaging negotiations that are going to stay his hand. Is any of this going to help in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon? The war goes on there.
Yeah, there's already disagreements over whether or not the 10-point plan actually covers what's now happening in Lebanon, with the Israelis engaging in effectively ethnic cleansing there. I mean, the New York Times has a long, very detailed story today about how Trump made the decision to actually go to war. And it makes it clear that he was largely persuaded by Benjamin Netanyahu, who came to the White House and did a very slick presentation. I think of this as one con man getting conned by a better con man, because it's pretty clear that although some of Trump's aides had misgivings, Trump decided to go with Bibi. Now, it's possible that Trump, who is a vengeful person, we know that from his political career, may be sufficiently angry at what he got dragged into or what he got lured into, that he then takes a much firmer line with Israel. He hasn't done that before, but he might do that since. I think the other thing we ought to watch out for is that, again, because Trump tends to be vengeful, he will turn on others who he thinks let him down. For example, our NATO allies. And it's interesting that in his press conference a day or two ago, the very end of the press conference, he talked about how the NATO was a paper tiger, they'd let us down, and he ended the press conference, which was all about Iran, by saying, NATO's a paper tiger, it all began with Greenland, we want it, they didn't want to give it to us, and I said bye-bye. So it seems to me we could be in for more trouble and more friction with some of our allies if Trump is looking for someone to punish.
Going full circle, final question. What was your personal reaction when you opened up the newspaper, or you opened up your computer and read Trump's Truth Social post that talked about ending Iranian civilization forever?
I thought it was two things. I thought it was a sign of just how desperate he was, that he was really flailing out, that he had no options, so he just decided to throw a bunch of rhetoric at the wall, if you will, and see if it went anywhere. And then, of course, immediately he backs down, within a day and accepts the ceasefire. But the second thing that occurred to me is how much this sort of thing has been normalized. I mean, we've now had Donald Trump in the center of political life life for 10 years in the United States, and he has said any number of outrageous things about a variety of subjects, whether it's immigrants or women or whatever. And we've gradually gotten accustomed to this kind of raving, something that no prior American leader would ever have gotten away with. Right? And I think a consequence is that the rest of the world looks on at us and wonders what's happened, not to Donald Trump, but rather what's happens to Americans, and why are 30% of the American people still supporting this guy?
Kenneth Roth, you've laid out the compelling question of why Trump openly called for war crimes, but you've also said there are other fundamental issues.
What was the point of this war? Ostensibly, it was to deprive Iran of the capacity to build a nuclear weapon. But Iran had already said it wouldn't build a nuclear weapon. It was willing to subject itself to intrusive inspections. It was willing to, allow a very low level of enrichment. That was the Obama deal that Trump ripped up. So what has happened since then? We actually are worse off. Because Trump ripped up that deal, Iran now has canisters of highly enriched uranium, which would be just, say a week away from bringing them up to the level required for a nuclear bomb. It takes more to actually fashion that highly enriched uranium into a bomb. But nonetheless, we're much worse off than we were under the Obama deal. On top of that, though, Iran has now discovered its asymmetrical weapon. It can close down the Strait of Hormuz. It can undermine the global economy. And it's now, threatening to impose tolls, a huge cost for every ship that goes through the strait, something it never would have done before Trump's war of choice. So, this was a war without a political justification. Iran seemed to be moving toward a negotiated solution that would have ensured it didn't get a nuclear bomb. But Netanyahu didn't want that. Netanyahu wanted to bomb away, as he always does, and was able to persuade Trump to start the war. Trump had no exit plan, and even now we don't know what the exit plan is. He says that Iran is going to agree to remove the highly enriched uranium. He says that Iran will give up what it says is its right to enrich. Proof's going to be in the pudding. Iran hasn't said that. And I think, in many ways, Iran is in a better negotiating position today than it was before this war. It's already suffered the worst. It's lost its leadership. It's suffered bombardment. What more does it have to lose? It is willing to, deploy the tool that it has, which is the harm to the global economy of closing down the Strait of Hormuz. So it'll be interesting to see what Trump can come up with in these negotiations. He's going to try to declare victory, but he's going to be lucky to come up with anything that is as good as, let alone better, than what Obama had already negotiated.
First, we have to really come to a clear comprehension of what regime change means in the context of a country like Iran. This has been portrayed in fundamentally flawed and deficient ways. Does it mean the removal of one person? It happened, and I guess so many people were saying that, and for years we have been hearing this conversation, that the day the supreme leader of Iran is dead, the following day there would be a new beginning, and the leader of the exiled monarchy would be heading back to Tehran to run the country. And we cannot in perpetuity expect that everything happens within the frameworks and conceptual abstract structures of exiled provisional transitional councils, groups that decide, make decisions, sign documents here without any tangible impact on the lives of Iranians living in their country. At the same time, yes, Israel has been pushing for this for years, for decades, basically, just because we know today that the nuclear excuse has just been an excuse. First, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. Second, when Donald Trump actually bombed 3 major Iranian nuclear sites last year at the end of the 12-day war, that pretty much concluded Iran's nuclear file, and he victoriously announced that Iran's nuclear program was taken out and eliminated. And I mean, technically it's correct. There's nothing left of that infrastructure anymore. But why did the US and Israel need to launch another unprovoked act of military aggression and go to war against Iran under the same nuclear excuse? Well, listen to the Trump's White House press briefing after the rescue mission that they conducted in Iran, all I could hear was the repetition of the same tropes, the same cliches, that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. So if Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, fine. Why are you bombing Iran's bridges? Why are you bombing Iran's railroads? Why are you bombing Iranian universities? Why are you bombing Iran's cultural sites? Do they actually have anything to do with that hypothetical nuclear bomb that you're scaring everyone up? And for Israel, of course, this has been much broader concept, because this expansionist ideology that runs the Israeli government today doesn't limit itself to one military actually conflict, the one front line. One day it's Iran, one day it's Lebanon, one day it's, they have been clearly mentioning the idea of floating around the idea of maybe at some point going to war with Pakistan, maybe Turkey.
Trump and Hegseth were utterly contemptuous of international humanitarian law. That is to say, the Geneva Conventions and their protocols, which are designed to spare civilians the hazards of warfare. We saw something similar in Israel's, massive bombardment of Gaza. We've seen similar conduct by Putin in Ukraine, by the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan, by the Rwandan-backed forces in Eastern Congo. So these are serious violations. Is this the end of international humanitarian law? Actually, no, I don't think so. Because, one way to look at this is to, imagine that somebody commits a murder on the streets outside. Now, if the police investigate, find a suspect, prosecute, then you have a horrible crime, but you have a reaffirmation of the criminal law. But on the other hand, if the police were to say, oh, we never liked that guy, we're just as happy to have him dead, we're going to ignore this crime, that undermines the law. So what do we have in this case? We have a series of very visible, high-profile violations, but the world has responded with outrage. The International Criminal Court has charged people in the case of Gaza and Ukraine. It's investigating in Sudan and Eastern Congo. The International Court of Justice has gotten involved in Gaza. The UN Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, sometimes the Security Council has stepped in. There's been broad condemnation.
Broad condemnation. Holding the line while we all hold our breath over a fragile ceasefire that was tested from the very earliest hours of its implementation. The whole world is watching because the stakes for fundamental human rights are universal. The stakes for the global economy, all of those things hang in the balance. I want to give our thanks to Stephen Walt, Kenneth Roth, and Kourosh Ziabari for sharing their thoughts with us. That's The Brief. I'm Jim Clancy, and thank you for joining us.